Hey, good afternoon, class. I hope you had a good couple of weeks. Our first discussion in week one went excellent. I had a lot of fun with it. I hope you guys did too. I promise to keep this video shorter than I did the last one and not ramble on. So this is my classroom. I'm at work today, so I'm sitting at my desk. I got my coffee, which is really all that matters. I have a ton of fundraisers to get out this week over there. Let's give you guys, there you go, quick room tour. I have a very, very complicated and busy room, but I love it so much. And I have a ton of grading I collected today that I have to also get to. But without further ado, I think we want to go ahead and tackle the question of the differences between freedom and liberty, which I thought going in was going to be an easy question to answer. And really, after doing so much reading and so much research, I do feel confident with my answer, but it is way more complicated than I think most of us give credit for. So let me share my screen if that's okay. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this all works. There we go. All right, it takes a second for it to get there. And there we go. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at my presentation here. Distinguishing between freedom and liberty. That's what I go ahead and title this. And I just start with, it's just a difficult analysis to begin with. This week's discussion question, while seemingly simple, has led to a plethora of different interpretations. I first looked here at Hannah Pitkin in the article, Are Freedom and Liberty Twins? I thought that was a pretty good place to start, my foundation understanding. And they're going to go ahead and outline that the fact that speakers of English have that unique opportunity that they get to choose between the word liberty and freedom, since not really a lot of other European languages are going to use those terms interchangeably. They don't necessarily have that choice. So really in our daily use of the terms, freedom and liberty kind of have been used virtually interchangeably when in fact they do not mean the same thing. Simply put, there is a drastic difference between the terms, and I do believe it's our civic responsibility that we distinguish between each one. So in looking at defining what each of those terms were, I went back and looked at the classical civilizations first, some of the readings that we did last week, and some other readings I did on my own. So we have DC's Schindler's Aristotle, Freedom as Liberality, right? Aristotle built on the work of Plato and Socrates, as most of us know, Plato being Aristotle's teacher and Socrates being Plato's teacher, especially on the concept of freedom. But when it comes to that concept of freedom, it was mostly a political freedom, more so than a broad use of the term. Political freedom is to receive and so pass on a goodness that transcends both the individual and the polis, because it transcends all things. Freedom, as expressed in the virtue of liberality, is goodness made fruitful. I really like that quote, but again, the two terms there, I have, virtue of liberality. We have the idea of being liberty in there, and freedom. They're kind of used to define one another, though a definition starts to form when I look at this article, that freedom is something that requires action. They say here to pass on, goodness made fruitful, having a purpose behind it. So my understanding of freedom really starts to delve into that concept that freedom is something that requires some sort of action. If I go into other classical civilization texts, I've been looking into for my final thesis, I've been looking a lot into reading different works of Aristotle, and I've been really working through the last week his book on politics. And he quotes, the end aimed at by a city is living well. And these things are for the sake of that end. And a city is an association of families and villages and a complete and self-sufficient life. And we claim that this is living happily and beautifully, and must be set down, therefore, that the political association is for the sake of beautiful actions and not for the sake of living together. All right. For this reasons, those who contribute most to such an association play a greater role in the city than those who are equal to them in freedom or superior to them in birth, but are unequal in political virtue. Virtue we're going to get into, but this concept here by Aristotle, he is putting that idea, that freedom is the participation, okay, into creating a polis that is worth living in, just not the fact of being free to live within those confines. Virtue is a large concept of Aristotle's work, one we're going to look at more, I'm sure. From last week's readings, that he ties to freedom, and he also ties it a lot with slavery. Okay, Aristotle, has a little bit of that with freedom. Slaves work for something or someone outside of their self, and thus is ruled over. So, in Aristotle's time, slavery is going to be, prominent. Though it's interesting to see that individuals can be seen as not free, like a slave, but also not free that they are not necessarily doing their duty for their civilization by not participating. So I thought that was kind of unique. A free man works for a virtuous life that acts for their own well-being. So looking at a free man, they're going to be considered free when they're working for the well-being of themselves, the well-being of others by participating in that government. And if they don't, they're not living a virtuous life. And to Aristotle, they're pretty much not free. Well-being is tied with the state and civic duty. One who works for money, so selfish desires, they're kind of become slaves to those desires, and according to Aristotle, are not free. So again, you see this concept of doing, but now you see this concept of doing as a duty to the state. All right, or the duty to your government, your duty to your politics is what, this kind of defines itself as. Then we read a little bit last week with the article by Cicero that delves into liberty and not just freedom, where Aristotle I looked at as more just freedom. While using terms still quasi-interchangeably, the article shows that even slaves can have a semblance of liberty. It's kind of cool. Aristotle says, that freemen can be like slaves. In this way, Cicero was kind of saying that slaves can have a semblance of liberty if they have a master that does not rule over them with an iron fist, but they still lack liberty as they are not free from the threats of coercion and the threats of the discretion of others, meaning that they really can't make their own decisions. So, what does this all mean? From the classical civilizations, from what I read last week, from what I read on my own, from some of the primary source work I've been doing for my thesis here, that freedom is a political action, not just an action, but a political action and the civic responsibility that's guided through virtue. And virtue, when you get into it, is really through education, which is something I go into further later in some of my research. All right. Where liberty is being free from the threats of being controlled or coerced. All right. Liberty is the idea of having those freedoms, where freedom is the idea of working for political action to maintain those freedoms through virtue. All right. So my current understandings are coming through some other articles that I've read and some of the readings from this week. We have Horatio Spector had an article, Four Conceptions of Freedom, that outlined the modern debate on freedom, our contemporary understanding. It claims it was framed by Isaiah Berlin. And I've seen this guy come up a lot in a lot of my research, and why I wanted to go ahead and read some more articles by him. So in 1958, he gave a lecture called The Two Concepts of Liberty. So this is going to help me define that liberty term. Berlin popularized the division between a negative liberty and a positive liberty. They're two separate things. Liberty is the idea is to be in one's own master. No one really can go ahead and coerce you, or they can't control you. But Berlin regarded positive liberty as something from within, more virtuous. That's self-mastery, self-control, self-government, being, controlling over your own actions. Where negative liberty is the absence of an impediment to the realization of our chosen ends. All right. So where if I would have a positive liberty, a self-mastery education, I'm working towards a goal, it helps in times to have a negative liberty as well and live in a state that guarantees me those freedoms to not impede me achieving those individual goals. That I thought very interesting. When looking deeper into the negative liberty, again, as the absence of impediments to the realization of our chosen ends, impediments can be viewed here as either tyrannical leaders, violating natural law. Okay, that's one aspect, but it's just also general lawlessness, If you're looking at somebody free to do as they want because they live off the grid and completely by themselves, if they're living with outside the law, do they really have liberty? Because somebody can come in and take that from them. There's no laws to guarantee them their freedom. So further understandings of liberty and freedom I'm going to get this week, right? Liberty is more than being free from the threat of being controlled or coerced, like we've seen with Cicero. It doesn't, though, mean to live outside the rule of law as well. The rule of law is key. There is a connection between liberty and freedom where it is through our civic actions. Our civic actions are our freedom, our duties, that we protect our liberty. Okay. And then I wanted to just connect that with some of the Enlightenment thinkers that we've been doing, because they all kind of say a little bit something different, but you can learn so much from looking at all of them. All right. Theseus, right, promoted a moral individual identity was key to a happy life and individual rights. These rights, though, were only protected within the framework of a state community or a commonwealth. All right. So he's emphasizing, the need to have these things protected, but it was more on a local level or a state level, not this huge idea of a federal government. Okay. And he was emphasizing an individual identity. Okay. Jefferson kind of summarized some of the same things, that the central government was endowed with only very few powers, that it should be the state government that has the powers. His central powers, all right, for the government, for that central government, should be to regulate commerce, to make foreign treaties, and to provide for defense. And that's really it. And there should be a state, as Theseus would say, more of a commonwealth that would make sure that that larger entity doesn't overstep their powers and then starting infringing on the liberties of those that they are supposed to constitute. And then Hobbes comments on the French Revolution as departing from the Middle Age liberty, all right, where new centralization of government power could have been corrupted and led it to a more despotic administration seen in the Roman Empire. So, all three of these individuals, you're looking at individual rights, individual liberties as being protected, yes, through free, through these actions of liberty. They don't want, though, an overly large government that can become despotic to overstep their bounds. All right. But on the other hand, we have Rousseau was against the idea of individual freedom. He wanted to push people to assimilate to one's culture and have one identity for a unit, as opposed to the individualistic ideas of those that we also talked about. And Lincoln, too, here, leaned more heavily into a centralized government after the Civil, for the Civil War, making state sovereignty an un-American thing, at least for the time they're following, pushing forth the agenda that Americans' union is indivisible, taking things away from some of the smaller state, ideas, the state power, and putting it more onto the federal government. So what does it all mean as a whole? Let me summarize this all. My video just kicked me out. I have no idea why it just kicked me out. So I'm going to mesh these things together so I don't have to go ahead and start again. I apologize for that delay. I'll make sure it all makes sense when we get it in the final editing. So I'm going to go back to present now. Hopefully I don't get kicked out this time. All right. I'm going to share my screen again and get back to my final summation where I do believe I left off. All right. Screen should be sharing. I hope now. Yes, no? There we go. Just took a minute, guys. So sorry about the technical difficulties. All right. So let me go back to this. What did this all mean? I'm just going to go ahead and do this slide again. All of these thinkers help shape the American conception of freedom and liberty. Everyone that we talked about helps really shape my ideas of what freedom is, what liberty is, as does the Magna Carta help shape it, as well as the Magna Carta helping shape our own, Constitution. We watched that video this week by Hannon, and it was just such a great video to watch. I know a lot of what he was espousing was, reminiscent of what he put in his book that we read, I guess, in week 1. But nevertheless, it's so great to see the passion that he had when he goes ahead and speaks on these matters. As a whole, the way I feel is we are endowed with liberties, but we are not a lawless land. Okay, it's just not the freedom to do whatever we want, how we want. We live under a code of law. All right, we are not a lawless land, but we live with these liberties to protect. All right, we have individual freedoms, and we do not need to live by a state-directed way of life as they do in maybe some totalitarian regimes. Anyone can be American. And I feel that way. Anyone can be American. It doesn't matter your skin color. It doesn't matter your religion. All right. By signing over to the overall American ideals of a liberty and of freedom, and even if maintaining your own culture, all right, is to that, your own individuality, one becomes American. Freedom and liberty define us as being American. These ideas are unique to the world, and we specifically protected and perpetuated these ideas during the world wars, when it's really England and the United States really facing a world of tyranny, of totalitarian dictators, of communism, of fascism, that these ideals are going to continue to be pushed forth and preserved and should be preserved. Our liberties, though, as outlined by that Magna Carta, are the law of the land, not the king's law, okay? Not the law of the church, the law of the land. That due process is guaranteed to all of their citizens, all right? That we don't follow some despot. Freedom, then, as Hannon puts it, is everyone's responsibility. Freedom is the enforcement mechanism whereby people participate in our republic. We vote, we deliberate on laws. It's our civic responsibility. It's our civic duty, all right, is what freedom is. It's our participation in our governments. Freedom is what, though, protects our liberties. All right. It protects the liberty that I have to be an individual, to fulfill my goals, that a government or a person is not going to stand in my way. All right. The two terms are not interchangeable. All right. Freedom is what protects our liberty. So with that said, let me go ahead and get back to my screen. I'm going to stop presenting. I hope that was as thought-provoking for you as it was for me. I greatly enjoyed it. Hopefully, I can go ahead and make this all work in the edits. All right, guys, have a lovely week. I look forward to looking at all of your videos this week. Enjoy.